for being here. Thank you to the board for supporting the great research that's going on here we're about to talk about. For those of you that aren't members of FPRI already and want to become one, you can come talk to me afterwards. There's all kinds of ways to get involved. I am so excited for this event. This guy right here, I've been trying to track down for so long. I've been following his research. I've been reading his research for years. We're pleased to welcome Jeffrey Ding, Professor Jeffrey Ding, who's a senior fellow this year at FPRI, and he's also a professor at George Washington University. And the reason I'm so excited about his research is I characterize him as a big thinker, because he not only has really tight granular knowledge of artificial intelligence and US-China competition, but he also, if you read this book, which I'm going to talk about in a second, it has this grand historical sweep, and he has the knowledge of an erudite economic historian who can tell you all about every industrial revolution that's taken place over the last couple of hundred years, the major players, how it ultimately plays out. And so, of course, he's been in popular demand, obviously, with his book, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, but also taking time away from scholarly work to write essays in foreign affairs that people are circulating around. He's testified in front of Congress. He's cited in all the major papers, Washington Post, Financial Times. He did his PhD at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, so probably a pretty smart guy. So we're just very lucky to have Jeff Ding with us this year at FPRI. I'm so grateful to Templeton and to the members of the board for making it possible for us to bring on really top-notch scholars who are also connected to the policy world and really just trying to help educate the broader public on really some of the most important issues today. So what we'll do over the next hour is I'll fire some questions at Jeff, which will give him a chance to talk about his book and his broader research, and then we'll leave some time, of course, for you all to answer or ask some questions. Then we'll break and have more informal conversation outside. So Jeff, welcome. And my first question is something I've been pondering for a while, which is this disjuncture between the shambolic state of American political institutions and then the US economy, which seems to be, at least relative to other countries, growing like gangbusters. I mean, by some measures, China's economy is shrinking relative to that of the US economy. 15 years ago, the Eurozone was the same size roughly in GDP. Now the US economy is almost twice the size of the Eurozone. I remember in the 1990s, when people still thought Japan was going to take over the world, Japanese incomes were 50% higher than American incomes. But now American median incomes are 250% higher than Japanese incomes. If Japan was a state in the United States, it would be by far the poorest state in the United States, well below Mississippi. If you look across, the U.S. is the top energy producer. The U.S., China and Russia seem to be self-immolating in various ways. So you get the point. So the United States has all these things going for it, and yet Americans' trust in government has plummeted to levels, historically low levels. We had a less than peaceful transfer of power. There may be a contested election in a few months. Scholars are top-notch scholars are talking about the possibility of a civil war in this country. I tend to think this is quite hyperbolic, but serious people are taking this issue seriously. So I feel like your research helps provide some understanding of how the system actually operates, and maybe the way we're looking at it doesn't quite capture the advantages the United States has. So how can you explain this paradox of extreme political dysfunction, or at least seemingly extreme political dysfunction, and yet booming prosperity, especially relative to competitors that we always thought, the Germans, the Japanese, we always thought they had a better system than us, and yet here we are.
Yeah. First of all, thanks, Mike, for that very generous introduction. I'm really glad to be here talking with you all today. If you purchase a copy of the book, you'll see in the references that there's a lot of mentions of this guy's name and works, so it's really shaped my ideas, and I can't think of no better person to be discussing this book with. On this idea of the disjuncture between the US's political dysfunction and its economic success, where I come at it is, how do states adapt to emerging technologies? Because these new advances provide the opportunities for rising powers like Japan or China today to overtake the leading power. And in the book, with the Japan case, yes, everybody thought Japan would be the #1 economic power. Japan had captured the leading shares of production in semiconductor components, consumer electronics, HDTV, all these newfangled technologies. But the US's advantage is that we were able to diffuse and adopt computers, which were this crucial general purpose technology, across the economy at a more sustainable and more effective and more intensive rate than the Japanese. And that was in part because the US's university systems, educational systems were able to adapt to this new engineering discipline, engineering-oriented discipline of computer science. And I think we're seeing a similar story play out in the US-China competition in AI and other emerging technologies, where China does have really strong firms and universities at developing some of these powerful models, but I think the US is much better equipped to adopt and diffuse these AI models across their entire economy, in part because the flexibility and the decentralized nature of our science and technology policy allows universities to adapt organically to shifts in technology rather than having the government impose a direction from the top down. So China, for instance, the Chinese government has designated an AI major that they've required all these different universities to implement. That would never happen in the US education system because we allow each institution to experiment with what is the best way to teach this new discipline. So that might be one part of the puzzle. Obviously, there's all these different factors that affect this distinction that you're talking about, but at least when it comes to the US's success in maintaining its technological leadership, I think that's one part of the puzzle.
I mean, you have so many great phrases and ways to think about this issue that you put out in this book. And can you say a bit more about this distinction you draw between the kind of standard way everyone looks at the rise and fall of great powers and the role that technology plays, namely this leading sectors approach, like whoever gets there first with the innovation is going to dominate the world, whereas you propose this diffusion of general purpose technologies, which you say is much more important. And there's this one part, I love this, where you say it's not so much about winning a marathon, or it's not about a narrow sprint, like you're just running as fast as you can in a very narrow lane on one type of technology. It's more of a marathon where you have this wide lane to run into, and so it's a more decentralized ecosystem that truly matters. Can you spell out that argument and kind of give us some of the broad strokes of the main pieces of evidence you use to support it?
Yeah, so the conventional wisdom that I'm trying to argue against this leading sector approach is very much centered on which country in these past industrial revolutions was the first to come up with the major breakthrough, whether that was the steam engine or the computer, or Germany with the new chemical innovations that created this whole fast-growing chemical dyestuffs industry. It's not so much about that type of monopolizing new to the world innovations and capturing all those profits. It's more about this wide marathon about which country can take these fundamental transformations, these general purpose technologies that affect all different economic sectors, and which country can adopt and diffuse those throughout their economy and embed them in productive processes. So I think a good way of thinking about it is oftentimes we think about countries as a firm with a new product innovation. And so you come out with this new iPhone and you have that brief window where you get to sell the iPhone with no competitors. And then over time, other people make smartphones and your profits decrease. And so you have to capture that brief window where you're monopolizing profits. I think of countries more as firms that are trying to adopt process innovations. It's not necessarily who was first to develop that new method, for example, electricity, to improve all these different processes throughout your entire country. It's more about, it's not necessarily who gets there first, and it's not that brief window of time. It's more just over a gradual period of decades. which country is able to diffuse and spread all these process innovations across all these different application sectors.
So yeah, so what's the special sauce then to master this more decentralized system? Because like I've tried to use this in my personal life with my wife, where it's like, how are we going to clean the house? I'm like, oh, don't worry, it'll kind of take care of itself. You know, this decentralized process, and that's going to be much more effective than your top-down authoritarian sort of methods. Doesn't necessarily go over so well. So what you talk about this thing called a skills infrastructure, that the countries that create this broader ecosystem where skills can be nurtured are the ones that really then can diffuse technologies very rapidly across industries. But what exactly is this skills infrastructure? And is it something that you can manipulate as a matter of policy? Like, can you actually enhance the skills infrastructure? Or is it basically like, you know, some places are just blessed for whatever reason, and that's just the way it's going to go?
Yeah, on the household cleaning point, hopefully AI will help with that one thing. But when it comes to this concept of skill infrastructure, what I mean by that is the system, the education and training systems that each country has that can widen the base of engineering skills connected to a general purpose technology. So what's interesting is after we get general purpose technologies, these fundamental advances that can't be boxed into one sector. After the emergence of these types of fundamental transformations, we often get a whole new engineering discipline. So think the process of mechanization and mechanical engineering. Think electricity that's followed by electrical engineering, right? The computer science is very much an engineering oriented discipline. So for me, the country that's best able to adapt to these general purpose technologies and diffuse them throughout their entire economy is the country that can develop this wide base of engineering skills. It's not necessarily about whether the US or China has the best and brightest AI scientists and experts. It's more about which country can have the best institutions to broaden the entire pool of just average AI engineering talent, or average mechanical engineering talent, or average software engineering talent. And so I think that's the key ingredient. How you get there can differ. I think some of that can be influenced by policy. So for example, in the second industrial revolution, we're talking 1870 to 1914, the US is very far away from the scientific frontier in a lot of these technologies. We send our best and brightest to study chemical engineering at German universities. But the US is really good at systemizing and training a wide pool of average mechanical engineers that can diffuse what's called this interchangeable parts manufacture system across all these different sectors of the economy. And part of the US's success of that can be attributed to a specific piece of legislation, the Morrill Act, which expanded all these land-grant colleges across the US to study the agricultural and mechanical arts. And these land-grant institutions were essential to broadening the base of mechanical engineering. But part of that is also attributed to the US's strong system of technical standard setting in the domestic level. And a lot of that actually happened in Philly with the Franklin Institute here, where industry associations connected this pool of mechanical engineering knowledge that was forming at universities and at technological institutes and systematized it so that everybody could meet, everybody knew what were the number of threads on a screw. Everybody knew, okay, this is how we were going to do interchangeable parts manufacturing in this field. And that spread this wide body of knowledge throughout all these different sectors and all these engineers working to implement mechanization in different sectors. So I think it can happen through different venues, whether that's explicit policy, whether that's through a more decentralized approach. Sometimes it's just randomness. Sometimes countries that are wealthier will just have more resources to spend on training a wide pool of engineering talent. So there's a lot of different factors. But I think the key is, what are you optimizing for? And I make the argument in the book that we should optimize for this skill infrastructure.
Is China doing that today? Because if you look at a lot of the things you just mentioned, you know, whether it's making sure you have this, what you talk about, widening the breadth of talent, just the sheer amount of talent in engineering up and down the levels. So you have this broad base setting the standards so the widgets all fit together, so to speak, and so they talk to each other, and then just investing resources in it. I mean, that sounds a lot like what the Chinese Communist Party is doing with these massive investments in emerging and strategic technologies. But you take a different view, and you're skeptical that this will necessarily catapult China to the lead in an area like AI, which you know very much about, or in other critical areas. So why is that? What's the point of failure here, or the aspect of this that China is not getting?
Yeah, I think to start with, there is some support for this view that you're talking about, that China has invested a lot in science and technology. They have focused a lot on technical education and vocational education and poured resources into that. And there are some technology areas where China has been strong in terms of adopting technologies at scale more effectively than other industrial competitors. So, for example, in high-speed rail, the Chinese government has been able to essentially implement or almost like mandate the wide-scale adoption of high-speed rail. In other areas where China wasn't burdened by legacy technologies, like in mobile payments and other consumer-facing apps, China has demonstrated some impressive diffusion capabilities. But I think the crucial part is, for general purpose technologies like AI, you can't really mandate the adoption of these from the center, from the top down. It has to make sense from a profit perspective for all these businesses in all these different sectors to choose, hey, this AI technique is going to be better than my existing software solution. There's a business case for that. And I think in some of these information and communications technologies that have to drive productivity growth at a business level, China has been much slower to adopt these technologies. So I cite data that on cloud computing adoption rates, for example, US businesses adopt cloud computing at double the rates as Chinese businesses. China also trails far behind in terms of adoption of smart sensors, industrial software, all of these other technologies that are similar to AI. And so I think that's a good predictor for what will happen in AI. And I think I'll go back to this point where a lot of China's efforts to improve its base of engineers is coming from like a centralized top-down directive, where you're trying to force all these different institutions to set up an AI major according to all these different parameters. And actually, that is reminiscent of what Japan tried to do in software engineering, where there was a strong focus on the education ministry playing a key role in setting all of these key standards for the emerging computer science discipline. They prioritized a few centers of excellence, and they didn't get this broad-based growth in software engineering talent. And I think we're seeing a similar thing play out in China. And sometimes I think we underrate the US's capabilities in this area. So one data point that we were talking about earlier is I looked at the number of universities that had at least one researcher, just one affiliated researcher that had published in an established AI conference, and I collected data for a bunch of different countries. China only had 29 universities that met that baseline mark. The US had 159. So once you get past the Tsinghua universities, the Peking universities in China, that top tier, it's not as wide of a bench. It's not as deep and wide of a bench. Whereas the US, you get past the CMUs, the MITs, the Harvards, you still have all these like University of California schools, Wisconsin school system, University of Texas school systems. You have this really wide and deep bench of institutions that can adapt to these new technologies.
That's so fascinating, because it seems like almost the exact opposite of what we're almost always told. Usually the idea is, yes, the US has the highest quality,
yeah,
but China, quantity has a quality all of its own. And I can't tell you how many articles from Eric Schmidt or Kai-Fu Lee or whoever are just saying China is pumping out scientists and engineers at a rate the US can't match. You're saying that's just flawed when you adjust for these kind of educational standards?
Exactly. Actually, one of the studies that both of those authors cite, uh, it does show that China is graduating more computer science students. But if you look into the data, the average Chinese computer science graduate, their skill level or their education level is like even below what a freshman computer science student in the US is developing. So yes, there is something about just more quantity in China, but if you control for just a baseline level of quality, I think that gap might even reverse.
Yeah, another thing we often hear is the United States is not investing enough or is reducing funding for things like basic R&D, the kind of like foundational, the theoretical work, and then the basic experiments, and that increasingly a lot of R&D is done by businesses, and so it's more for commercialization of existing technologies as opposed to the kind of like foundational innovation. And the sense I got from your book is that that might actually be a good thing, because what really matters is just trying to take technologies and get them to market quickly and then diffuse them and have them used across industries. But is there what's the relationship? Because it does also seem like you need to understand technologies and someone has to do the basic R&D, and if you were able to do it here, maybe it diffuses faster than if you're importing the idea from Brazil or China or wherever. Or is that simply not the case? That basically the U.S. can be this giant sponge, soaking up brilliant ideas from wherever, and then because it's got the most dynamic market, the deepest capital markets, it's always just going to be able to scale them faster than any other major economy.
Yeah, so I think if you're thinking about this from a very like Machiavellian strategist perspective, basic R&D is great, and I support investing in basic R&D, but basic R&D from a global competition standpoint, there's so, there's the spillovers diffuse across borders pretty quickly because we have such an interconnected globalized science system. So it doesn't really it might not necessarily provide that much of a relative advantage for your country. The relative advantage that I argue, it comes from connecting the firms doing this basic R&D, connecting the firms at the frontier to commercial applications and application-oriented R&D, but also not just on the R&D side, the skills training side, making sure that the engineering education is also connected to real world practical applications and having those connections. I think that's another really strong advantage of the US educational system.
Is there a good example you would point to that kind of illustrates this connection between the ones doing the foundational research and then being able to connect it to more commercialized?
So let's go back to that second industrial revolution period. Remember, Germany is leading the way on all the basic research. They're winning all the Nobel Prizes in chemistry. They are capturing all the publications in the key chemistry journals. But the US has developed this chemical engineering education system that is more connected to industrial practices, that is more lab oriented and shop oriented. You're doing exercises that apply these chemical principles, you're going beyond the theory and applying them to real world applications. And so I cite one translated German report from a German engineering professor that shows at different US universities that train people in engineering, maybe like 40% of the curriculum was dedicated to practical like laboratory and shop-based exercises. And in Germany, that amount for some representative German engineering schools was closer to like 5%. So there was that was part of the US's advantages. We were nowhere close to the scientific frontier when it came to all these technologies, but the US was ahead in terms of the diffusion of these techniques throughout all these different industrial application sectors.
Yeah, I mean, the winner, not to spoiler alert, but Britain and then the United States kind of win in a lot of these competitions, not to give away the crux of the book, but that then leads to, I want to challenge you by raising some potential alternative explanations, and then you can try to slay these and explain why these aren't really getting at the advantage, the Anglo-American advantage that just seems so stark over the last couple hundred years of history, and also kind of comes out of nowhere. Like, you can understand the frustration of the Russians, the Chinese, like the Germans, these British and American upstarts, when we had great civilizations, suddenly now seem to have mastered these modern technologies and now are trying to run the world. But I'm trying to figure out why that is. And one alternative explanation that occurred to me is just basic geography. So you look at the United States and Britain, they're both offshore powers. Britain obviously separated from the European continent, and the United States, friends and fish, two huge oceans, Canada and Mexico. And not just that, but Britain, from what I understand, happened to have a lot of cities next to massive coal deposits, which made it very cheap to just move coal. And it just incentivized the widespread mechanization that you see in the first industrial revolution. And then for the United States becomes this major oil producer at the start of that stage. And so my understanding is that, I guess my first question is, to what extent does just a safe offshore location and lots of fossil fuels, does that not just explain a certain percentage of this advantage that we've seen from Britain and the United States? It's not just that fuel is cheaper, it's that then it just incentivizes the tinkerers and the innovators to build machines that are going to harness this tremendous surge in energy potential that we got through coal and oil and other fossil fuels.
Yeah. It's a good challenge. The book's already published, Mike.
You addressed it in the book.
I think it's a great point in terms of, I think the book is focused on technological leadership, but I think there's all these other reasons having advantageous geographic location does in terms of national power and all these other channels. Focusing in on Britain and the US when it comes to access to natural resources and how that played into their advantages when it came to technology. Certainly, I think Britain's close location to cheap and plentiful coal reserves played a role in terms of their ability to adapt all these wrought iron based and like machine making practices that I see as really critical to Britain's technological leadership in the first industrial revolution. I think one point that is interesting is the Netherlands also had access to cheap coal. And when you look at the later timelines of when Britain's productivity actually demonstrably surpassed that of the Netherlands and France, by that time, cheap coal was more accessible to its rivals. So I'm not as convinced that natural resources explains everything. I think there is also a convincing, it is something that should be addressed when it comes to the US and the second industrial revolution. One of the reasons the US does adopt these interchangeable parts manufacturing methods faster than its rivals potentially is because wood and metals are just more abundant in the US. So that allows people to experiment with these methods. I think what was interesting is eventually Germany did adopt the same methods, but they still didn't get those efficiency gains because I think it was because the skills of the mechanical engineers trying to operate these techniques, that there was still that divergence. So I do think it explains some of it, but definitely not all of it.
Okay. The other commonality I saw between Britain and the United States was, I mean, obviously there's some difference, but the political institutions. And it got me wondering whether you would take your argument to say you kind of need a democratic system, or at least not a brutally autocratic system, because it just seems like if you're a dictator, you don't want to allow all these private you don't want all these networks forming and all this civil society and all these smart people talking to each other and making gizmos that can fit together and generating private wealth that can become political power over time. And so you'll do what Xi Jinping is currently doing, or at least seeming to be doing in China, just throttling the VC and the private sector. But do you think that's the case? Like, in other words, do you think autocracy is a potentially major hindrance to the type of diffusion that you see? Or is it just more of a coincidence that the two powers that have really mastered this diffusion advantage happen to be Britain and the United States with their more democratic living systems?
Yeah, so I think regime type does play a role, but I don't think it's determinative. So with democracies, there's also differences among democracies in terms of which country is able to better adapt to general purpose technologies and these industrial revolutions. So for example, Japan, the US-Japan competition in the 1980s, both are democracies in terms of regime type and how we code those, but they have different approaches to managing their economies. So Japan is more of like, I think I would say their approach to science and technology was much more centralized. Whereas the characteristic of the US approach is a decentralized approach. So I think for me, the key source of variation there is not necessarily regime type. It's more about the level of economic centralization. When it comes to China, I do think that the regime type plays a meaningful role. For me, it's about how does regime type shape who wins out in these contestations for technological leadership. I think oftentimes we focus on, can an autocratic regime come up with new to the world innovations? Can China innovate? Is like this classic question that people have been struggling with, and it's debated in all these Harvard Business Review articles. I think we've seen clearly with the internet, with AI, China can innovate. China can come up with fundamental breakthroughs. They have some of the leading firms in AI, some of the leading universities in AI. But I think where regime type comes in is it shapes these competitions over technological leadership by making it difficult to diffuse innovations at scale in this organic, fast-acting, market-oriented way. And I think we've seen that with China's recent actions where there's an encroaching reach of the party state on these tech companies. They're establishing these party committees across all these companies. And I think that sends a signal that says, you as a small, medium-sized business, how do you decide which way to go? How do you decide which technology to adopt? You're getting really mixed signals from the central government. You're almost afraid to do anything. It's new, and it's also just taking away the role of the market and like these civil society organizations, these industry associations, these standard setting organizations, and putting too much power into the role of the party state. And I think we saw that with the Soviet Union as well. So that's where the regime type argument intersects with mine.
Yeah, I mean, you point out that the Soviet Union outspent the United States on research and development, at least as a share of its economy, had more scientists, more PhDs with a science and engineering background, and yet, you know, one great power explodes and the other is still doing quite well economically. But then you're not just an expert on the rise of great powers, you're also an expert on artificial intelligence. And that's obviously just a broader issue that many people are wondering about. And I'm trying to get a grasp of it with no real expertise. And I veer from thinking the machines are going to be so powerful, they're going to kill us all, to thinking that this is nothing. Basically, this is like, it's a joke. Yes, maybe ChatGPT would help some professors, wordsmith their letters of recommendation. Not that I would know from any kind of personal experience, but it's very helpful for that. But it's not going to revolutionize the economy. And there's this great book by Robert Gordon about the rise and fall of American growth, and he notes that productivity growth across developed economies has been declining for some time. For decades. There's a brief bump after the internet revolution, but not very much. And what he argues is that the innovations today pale in comparison to what we had 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And he'll ask his students, would you rather keep your social media apps and your internet, but go without indoor plumbing for the next year, or electricity, or the automobile, or the jetliner, or like all of these standard innovations that completely revolutionize it, such that if you were living in 1870, you're probably living in like a shack with an outhouse. And by 1900, 1910, people already have a lot of the accoutrement of like modern life. And I just saw E.T. with my kids, in 1980s. And I was looking at the family there, and I'm like, their house looks a lot like our house, yeah, we got this internet, but this is more of a distraction. And so, in other words, like, can you talk about where you think artificial intelligence is going? I know it's a broad question, but do you think it's do you err more on the it's truly transformative? And I assume there are certain specific ways that it will be.
Yeah.
And then maybe in some other ways you think, I guess to what extent is it really one of these revolutionary general purpose technologies? I've heard it compared to fire and electricity. Is it really on par with these kind of broad-based general purpose technologies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's an existing debate among economists over Gordon's thesis of these new innovations will not have these revolutionary impacts, and others who do see AI having the potential to bring about huge waves of productivity growth. So the people on the other side of the debate, I probably lean more towards that side. Eric Brinkhoffson at Stanford's Digital Economy Lab has done a lot of data on this, where you're already seeing some signs of some signs of they look at all these different job postings and try to code whether AI would improve the function of that job. And in some ways, there really is an electricity-like effect where almost every job you can think of will be impacted in some way by AI. So I definitely do not do the recommendation letter thing that you talk about, but in my I thought about it, yes, but in my own work, for example, I was trying to code like 110 different Chinese patenting organizations by whether they were a state-owned enterprise, a firm, a university-affiliated research institute. This is some other research project I'm doing on the degree of commercial military integration in China. And I was able to basically feed that list to ChatGPT and get ChatGPT to code all 110 of those accurately based on these 5 categories in the span of 2 minutes. That would have taken me and a research assistant maybe at least a whole day to do that on our own. And it was accurate. I double checked it. So I do think there's certainly a lot of promise there. I'm not on the side of we will get artificial general intelligence that's better than humans at almost all economic tasks in like the next 5 years. I'm not on that side, but I do think there is an in-between ground where, like other general purpose technologies in the past, it will take some time, maybe at least another decade or 2 before these innovations diffuse across all different sectors at different rates. We will see the major potential for a productivity boost.
Okay.
And I think the Chinese government is really hoping that that is true, right? Because as you mentioned, a lot of their other growth factors are fading. The demographic dividend, urbanization, you can only get gains from urbanization for so long. You can only move so many people into cities. So now what is the source of long-term economic growth? It's adapting to these new technologies. And if general purpose technologies can produce this widespread productivity growth, that's why the Chinese government is focused so much on technologies like AI.
Get those armies of intelligent robots to replace the declining population. Okay, well, my last question before I open it up to these good people who've been waiting patiently to ask probably much smarter questions than I've been asking. I want to know, you work in DC, you advise the government, you testified in front of Congress. What is the United States either not doing right now that you think it should be doing, or what is maybe something that the U.S. is doing that maybe it shouldn't be doing in this area in terms of trying to foster the next round of innovation that will sustain its economic leadership?
Yeah, so for me, I think the leading sector model is influencing not just the US and sort of DC policymakers, but it also has an enduring influence on Chinese policymakers, where all these governments are fixated on making sure that they control and monopolize new to the world innovations in AI. And the US especially is fixated on preventing these AI breakthroughs from leaking to other countries, especially China. For me, I think we should rebalance our efforts away from that, which is not really the winning strategy when it comes to competition in industrial revolutions, because there's no way you can make sure that there's no way you can control these fundamental innovations like AI and electricity Instead, for me, the book argues that a better strategy for the US is to focus on ensuring we can adopt AI at more sustainable and intensive rates, embed AI across a broader range of productive processes in our own economy, essentially run faster than other countries, and continue to invest in what has sustained US technological leadership over all of these past industrial revolutions.
Great. Well, now we'll open up the floor. If you have a question, Christine and Connor have microphones, so please feel free to pick the brain of Jeffrey Ding.
Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for a very interesting presentation. I haven't heard anything so far about the intellectual property regimes in the several countries involved. Intellectual property, patent laws, and the like, are both designed to foster and protect innovation, but also to some degree to prevent its diffusion. How do you see the intellectual property regimes in our country, China, and elsewhere as having an effect?
It's a great factor to point out. I think for me, the intellectual property rights regime and sort of how strict your intellectual property protections are represent a good place of tension between diffusion-oriented strategies and protect innovation-oriented strategies. So oftentimes the leading sector model points to strong intellectual property rights protection as that key ingredient for success in technological revolutions. For me, my theory is less dependent on that. I think actually if you have too stringent of patent protections, you limit diffusion. So let me give one example in the contemporary period when it comes to competing over AI. Oftentimes there's a lot of concern in the US about how do we prevent China from undermining our intellectual property rights protection scheme and taking all of these valuable pieces of IP. And what's interesting is so much of the AI development ecosystem is founded on open source software, where you're intentionally not trying to protect the IP. And that's part of the US's advantage. I've translated Chinese white papers where they point out almost 66% of the AI open source software around the world is developed in the US. And they actually want to develop a better open source software culture. So obviously there are reasons to foster really strong intellectual property rights protection beyond just, the book is narrowly focused on these like long-term competitions over industrial revolutions. There's other reasons we might want to secure these technologies. But for my book's argument, they might actually be counterproductive for a diffusion-oriented approach.
One of the great advantages that we see is that most of the innovation stuff, application-wise, comes from the people at the bottom of the pile, not from the people at the top. I mean, a current example is, you've read many articles about how innovative the Ukrainian army is in modifying and using technician, or comparing, say, the difficulty that the Russian military structure has, because it's essentially top-down compared to the US structure, the Ukrainian structure. So, that has to be a major concern when you look in terms of the government structure, because one pushes, I mean, years ago, and it really was a lot of years ago when I did work with companies going into China, you found right away that the research in China innovation was not the way. The reverse engineering was the way to go, and that there was no advantage for them in spending the money or the time on the research. It was more efficient for them economically to be able to reverse engineer things and not worry about it the other way. So do you think that's changing at all, or it's still going to continue in that fashion?
It's a great point. I think a lot of scholars have pointed this out as a reason why some rising powers are able to catch up to the technological frontier, but they're never able to overtake at the technological frontier because they're used to the technological leader laying out the roadmap here's all these lanes you don't have to go down because the leader has shown these are the technologies that are worth pursuing, and then the laggard just copies those or reverse engineers those, to your point. I think there's enough evidence that China today is at the technological frontier of a lot of different fields, not just AI, but innovations in electric vehicles and clean energy. I think there's a strong case to be made that now US firms should try to absorb more of the knowledge from the Chinese leaders in some of these spaces. So for me, innovation leadership will be contested between the US and China. It's more about who is going to be able to scale these technologies and adopt them throughout their entire country.
Hi, good evening. My name is David Weisman. I have a question. We've been talking about industrial giants, economic giants, whether it's the US, China, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious where a tiny nation the size of New Jersey, with a population about 1/40th of that of the United States, frequently called the startup nation, referring to Israel. How does that fit into the equation when we're talking about what that country has done in a brief time and the impact that they have technologically and so forth?
Yeah, it's a great example, and this gets into some of Mike's work as well. As for the scope of this book, I'm focused on competition between great powers. And power in international relations, as Mike has argued, is best defined as a product of economic size and economic efficiency. So we focused a lot on the economic productivity part of things, but you also have to have a baseline economic size to be in the conversation to be a great power, at least according to like international relations scholarship. So Israel just doesn't necessarily have the economic size to qualify, even if they are probably very competitive when it comes to adopting and diffusing new technologies at scale. But so I think there's a lot to learn from Israel in terms of how they built strong linkages between the government. They also welcomed a lot of international talent, like Soviet immigrants, to develop these really strong clusters. But I think the insights from this book are mostly targeted at the population of great powers.
Can you also say a bit, because in the book you discuss these theories that say external threat, like a country that's facing existential threat.
Yeah.
Some people think just they're going to be more innovative because they have to be. You know, the Ukrainians, for
And
example,
Israel as well.
yeah, and of course the Israelis. So can you use this as an opportunity to kind of talk about your view on the role that geopolitical threats play in motivating countries or not to diffuse innovations?
Yeah, so I think this is a compelling thesis. Other folks have written about this, including Mark Zachary Taylor at Georgia Tech, arguing that a state that faces this existential geopolitical threat is then almost compelled to invest in science and technology. And I think we've seen this in the US context where it's almost, we overhype these other technological competitors because it's almost what is needed to grease the wheels to make sure there is bipartisan consensus on certain technology policies. For me, I did not necessarily see that playing the pivotal role in all these cases. So between Britain and France in the first industrial revolution, both faced external threats. And in fact, France was embroiled in a lot more conflicts, but Britain was the one who came out ahead in terms of adopting general purpose technologies. The US in the second industrial revolution certainly faced a less threatening international environment than Germany did in that 1870 to 1914 period, but it was the US that came out ahead. So again, I think it does maybe play a role in some contexts, but was not a determining factor in the cases I studied.
Thank you. So as you went through a lot of your comments, it kind of struck me that it seemed in addition to technological revolutions, there's also a parallel revolution in education in the US, religious, political, sometimes working in favor of the Industrial Revolution, sometimes working against it. Is that a pattern you've noticed?
It's a great question. This is one of those things that is on the Google Doc notes sheet as a bullet point of things for future research. And it's something I'm really interested in as to why did the US develop a broader base of mechanical engineering talent? Some of it was, there was a form of educational revolution happening in the US around this time. I think Claudia Golden at Harvard has talked about the investments in like high school education of the US at that time period. And then also the US was unique in co-educating girls and boys. So, and you see all these play out in STEM education today too, right? In terms of maybe one of the sources of US advantage might be just better gender equity when it comes to engineering education. And you certainly didn't see that in Japan, and you certainly don't see that in China to the same extent. So that's something I didn't necessarily have the toolkit or the knowledge base to explore that further, but that is definitely a future research direction I'm really interested in.
You describe even England and France. I'm a Catholic, so I guess I can say it. I think of the Catholic Church perhaps inhibiting in the revolution in England away from the Catholic Church, enabled them to maybe progress in ways other countries couldn't.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, religion and gender and how they interact with education. I think it's a fascinating parallel.
When you use the language coming out ahead, and in reference to Michael, what you said at the beginning about how Japan, which seemed to be galloping forward in the late 80s, I'm asking myself, what exactly is your definition of coming out ahead? And what would you say might be the discrepancy with that perhaps quantifying definition of what it means to come out ahead over and against what an average human being might think of as ideal existence? Like, I'm imagining being a country like Japan that's clearly a very formidable society and economy and universe unto itself. How do you look at the future and fold into the cake that you're trying to bake all of these different strands of what makes life worth living? So how are you defining when you would define the US as being the one that came out ahead? I just feel in my bones that Americans don't forever want to have the burden of being the leading nation. It's a stress that's really, the quality of life is a big deal.
Yeah, it's a great intervention in terms of what does winning actually look like? And winning might not be being the most productive economy, right? That might conflict with quality of life. For the purposes of the book, I'm trying to look at how do technological revolutions affect the rise and fall of great powers, and I'm playing into work and definitions other people have established. So Paul Kennedy's classic work, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, says one of the key steps to becoming a great power or to becoming the hegemon is being able to sustain higher rates of economic growth than your rivals over the long term. And so the way I define that and operationalize it in the cases is among the set of potential great powers, at what point did a rising power kind of overtake the leader in terms of productivity over a long period of time? And yeah, so for us in terms of international relations scholars, we're very concerned about that because that translates to military and geopolitical influence, and that's sort of the economic power is this fungible resource that translates into all other forms of power projection. But from a living a meaningful life perspective, we might have different definitions of what winning looks like.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
I'll take one if I'll do another one if you don't have.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in and speaking today. I really learned a lot today. I just wanted to ask, when you were talking about strategies used by different countries, I know most countries are using AI to their strengths, even if the strengths are, still behind our capabilities or where we're at, and we're still leading in them. So I know when countries use them to give it still as an edge over us, such as Iran, Russia, and China using AI in their cyber threat intelligence techniques, and even in cyber warfare, or even in current political deepfakes that are still happening right now. How sustainable do you think this strategy will be in being as like a competitor against our industries? And do you think you see US be able to mitigate it and even diffuse the strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think certainly rival countries have developed key competencies in certain applications of AI. So you mentioned AI-enabled cyber attacks. Other vectors, for example, like China just deploys more facial recognition in surveillance applications than the US for obvious reasons. For me, the key question is, how does that play into broad-based productivity growth? And the gentleman's question earlier, who can sustain economic growth rates at higher levels? Being really strong in terms of cyber espionage and AI-enabled election interference or stuff like that, that's not that, or even facial recognition, being able to surveil your population at a more precisely grained scale, that doesn't really connect with or correlate with this broad-based productivity growth that things like electricity brought. So I think it might be important for certain aspects of power, such as like cyber espionage and things like that, but not as important for this like long-term marathon between great powers. One more.
Hey Jeff, thanks for coming in. I used to work a long time back in AI and robotics and everything. And I just wanted to know, like, what has changed in the last 20, 25 years now that everybody's talking about AI? I mean, it's been there for a really long time. So what is that? What are those factors or things which actually change so that now everybody thinks it's a cure-all or do-all for a lot of things?
Yeah, so probably back when you were working in AI, the dominant approach was a statistical rule-based approach, right?
Yes.
If this input, we run it through the statistical algorithm, we're going to output this.
Yes.
So starting in 2000s, there was this ImageNet project at Stanford where they collected all this data, all these images, the largest scale image data set, and they had people see who could do a better job of identifying different images as like cats or dogs or things like that. And these scholars developed this AlexNet approach that relied on deep learning or layering a bunch of neural networks together, where it was no longer the statistical approach, it was this whole new approach called the deep learning paradigm. So that's where one hard part about this book is, when does a GPT start, right? So does it start with the electric dynamo in 1870, or does it, if it started, we've been talking, there's been AI for years and years, yes. But for me, this current period, I date it as the AlexNet submission to this ImageNet competition. And that's what really incubated this new paradigm of deep learning.
Turning point.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
So the book is Technology and the Rise of Great Powers. The scholar is Jeffrey Ding. Please join me in thanking Professor Ding.